Hi, I'm Jim Gabe, founder of Citizen Arts. Welcome to our new episode of In Their Words, What Public Officials Do for Us, a series that takes a close look at some of the vast range of people who service at the federal, state, and local levels. Why a close look? Because we entrust them with responsibilities and powers that affect our lives in big and small ways every day. If you haven't listened to our prior episodes, please do. You'll hear that state secretaries of state do far more than certify elections. For example, in Washington state, fighting cyber election misinformation. And you'll have an interlude with a non-judgmental California judge. Yeah, you heard that right. She cuts through increasingly critical public discourse about justices with insights into the noble role of those called to the bench. Today, we visit the State Assembly of New York. Citizen Arts is honored to present a conversation with Assemblymember Joanne Simon, a self-described lifetime fighter for equal rights, an exemplar of community activism who's been elected to state government with over 90% of the vote in her Brooklyn community. She's a nationally recognized expert on and advocate for the rights of otherly abled people in education, transportation, healthcare, and more. She's a leader in seeking and obtaining sensible gun laws. Yes, she has been at the ramparts and has made a positive difference on issues that affect so many of us. You'll find her full bio in the show notes and at citizenartscreative.org. Welcome, Assemblymember Simon. Thank you for taking the time to join our discussion.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
I'm going to get right into it. State legislatures are almost always composed of a state assembly and a state senate, similar to the U.S. Congress with its Senate and House of Representatives. State legislatures are making a lot of national headlines these days. There are the Tennessee Three, the censoring and barring of Zoe Zephyr in the Montana House, all sorts of laws passed and protested related to abortion, guns, and so forth. Many of these extraordinary events are happening because a record 23 states now have veto-proof supermajorities in their assemblies. Quite different from what we currently see in the U.S. Congress. Most are Republican, but New York State has had a Democratic supermajority for decades. How do you see this growing partisanship divide affecting the ability of state legislatures to provide democratic representative government?
Well, let me just say that the New York State legislature was dominated in the Senate by Republicans for about 50 years. And in 2018, after the 2016 presidential election, the state Senate became democratically controlled. And then 2 years later, it became a veto-proof majority. I think one thing that people think is just because you have a veto-proof majority, you can override a veto easily. Sometimes those veto-proof majorities are very slim. In New York, not every Democrat agrees. We have a real urban versus rural, urban versus ex-urban kind of dynamic. You know, the issues are very different in urban life. It's one of the things that I think a lot of us feel very frustrated about sometimes with Congress. Congress hasn't been very urban friendly in many respects. And part of that is the way they have gerrymandered districts to control that conversation.
I am wondering whether that urban-rural divide, the increasing separation of parties due to gerrymandering, that state legislatures are not quite as representative as we would like. I look at some of the southern states and some of the Midwestern states and Western states where there are more extreme things being passed. I also wonder whether you feel in New York we're embracing pluralism as we should.
Well, I certainly can say that when the cameras are off, legislators are not as grandiose in their commentary. They pick up, it seems to me, the national commentary. So when we were debating in New York not long ago, a bill that would provide access to mifepristone on college campuses, for example, a lot of the rhetoric was not about that, but a lot of it was just misinformation, the kind of classic misinformation you hear all the time, even though people I know better. Something I heard last night, there was this misreporting that Roe versus Wade provides for abortion right up until the moment of delivery, and even after that, which is totally idiotic, right? It's ludicrous. But that comes up all the time for some reason, right? And they parrot this stuff. There are more of those kinds of extreme positions being voiced just because that's the way that they debate. They pick up on the arguments that are being used by others in other states, even though they're completely irrelevant. It's increasingly frustrating to have misstatements made on the record. It's really posturing for the cameras, and that I think wastes time. It keeps us from passing bills that are really important to people's lives. I do think that there is an increase towards authoritarianism that is really making great waves around this country. There are people who don't want anybody to control their lives because they don't want to take a vaccine, but they're very happy to control your life in every other way. And you saw that in the New York governor's race last year, where there was a lot of misinformation about public safety and making people feel frightened. I'm on the subways every day when I'm not in Albany. The subways are not a hellscape. Are there issues in the subway? Sure. Is it anywhere near like what it was in the 80s and 90s? Not at all.
It doesn't seem like we're trending in a direction that would make it easier for public officials to contend with misinformation and disinformation. People can just get up on their digital platform and say whatever they want to say. And in some cases, they're going to get, depending who they are, get quite a hearing. How do your colleagues contend with that? If you're trying to do the real business of the people, is this something that you're seeking to address in some way? Is there any way you can address it?
Well, AI is a big issue. And I just saw a colleague of mine who's an expert in this area sent around something about a bill that he's proposing. That certainly is something that a lot of people are aware of. We are very concerned about privacy issues. Some of those issues are more difficult to do at the state level because these platforms are national and international. There are colleagues of mine who don't have a Twitter account because Twitter is like a space where people can't feel very free to just repeat themselves and they repeat misinformation. There's no sense of proportionality. We see it now with the incident of Jordan Neely, who was killed in a chokehold on the subway by a guy who we don't know really very much about. We don't know much about his mental state. So you have people talking about, well, he was frightened, but the law is very clear. You can't use lethal force when you're not threatened with lethal force. So how do we deal with that? Part of this rhetoric about the dangerousness of the subway makes people think that it's really dangerous and that this guy should have been able to do that. People don't know how to sort those things. I find that very frustrating. And so one of the things that I try to do is to talk about facts and address the issue that is really the issue, right? As opposed to the rhetoric. And one of the things that I think is hardest to do for an elected official is to not respond to just the rhetoric, but to recognize that the rhetoric is out there, the feelings are out there, the concerns are out there, the fears are out there, but so is the misinformation.
Joanne, you were the first in your family to attend college.
Mhm.
You have a master's in education of the deaf and a law degree. You established a disability civil rights law firm in Brooklyn, and you became a nationally recognized expert in the field. You're on the law faculty of Fordham University. In 2014, you entered the primary for New York State Assembly and won, and then won in the general election. How come you ran for political office? And where did you get the know-how to do this?
Someone was shot at the bodega across the street from my house. And I'd been living in my neighborhood for quite some time, which, it was, if you talk to people about living in and near downtown Brooklyn in the 80s, it was a very different place than it is now. So I got involved in the block and started doing things with neighbors. And somehow or other, I ended up president of the Block Association and then became president of the Neighborhood Association. When you're in a neighborhood association that is civically active, it's amazing the things you get involved with. We have a lot of congestion in and around downtown Brooklyn as traffic makes its way through the bridges. And so I ended up getting very involved in that intersection of land use, transportation, environment, and health, because you can't live where I live without those issues being at the forefront all the time. I worked with other neighborhoods because they had a lot of the same problems, and we were much more effective working together than working separately. Now I'm sort of a transportation geek, and that was a really big environmental justice issue because the communities that were most affected are those lower income communities of color who are really suffering under the environmental burdens. So because of that perspective, I really got involved with everyday life and got to know my elected officials. I got a sense of what they were doing. And one of my councilmen at the time said, Joanne, you ought to run for office because you're at every meeting and you're not getting paid for it. So when my assembly member decided not to run for reelection, I was very well steeped in all the issues in the district. And with her support, I ran for the assembly and won.
How was it different to actually campaign? I've been very involved in my community, dealt with politicians all the time. I always thought that making that leap from being a community active person to actually running for elective office was a bridge too far. And yet you made that leap. What did you find out when you made that move that you didn't know? I mean, did you like campaigning? Did it come naturally to you?
There were some aspects of campaigning that didn't. One of them is, as a community leader, you're always talking about community and about coalition and about policies and issues. And when you're campaigning, you need to talk about yourself in a different way and how you will change the way things are happening, right? That how you will represent the community and take their voices with you to Albany on those issues. As a neighborhood association leader, I certainly knew that not everybody agreed with each other on those very basic day-to-day issues. And you certainly find that out in greater detail when you're campaigning. The other thing is the mechanics of campaigning, right? I had done work as the Democratic district leader in the area and certainly done campaigning for other people. But when it's yourself, it's much harder to figure out how to start the conversation, right? Because it's you they're evaluating, not the person you're campaigning for. So it's kind of an adjustment in that regard. But I found that there were a lot of things that I took to naturally. I know a lot of people, but I'm also not hesitant to talk to people who I didn't know, right? So going up and talking to people you don't know, asking for their signature on a petition, knocking on doors. Sometimes you get really crotchety people. You get people who yell at you because they're they need to feed their child kind of thing. And you just have to move on to the next door. The other part of the mechanics is actually all of the sort of fundraising and the production of campaign materials and figuring out where your vote comes from, going through those election districts and knowing who actually votes, who are your prime voters, who isn't a prime voter. There are many people involved civically that that aren't voters or that don't vote in primaries, right? Or are independent. They're not registered in any party. And so they can't vote for you in a primary. So you get more steeped in that sort of detail and minutia of the actual running of a campaign and the pacing of a campaign. And then things like picking your colors and approving the materials. And everybody wants to say a lot in their materials, but people don't read a lot in those materials. So you really have to distill that.
What's the demographic of the district you represent?
It is certainly increasingly white and well off. I joke that when I moved to my old block of Borum Hill, there were only 4 brothels left.
There are only 4 brothels left.
It was a very different time. With renewed interest in living in the city, I think what happened in the 90s, there were a lot of people, for example, who had been working in restaurants, fancy schmancy restaurants in Manhattan, and they were ready to open their own places. And they moved to Brooklyn where they could buy a house reasonably. They had a little backyard. They could open a restaurant. And it would be a third of the price of going to dinner in Manhattan. So people started realizing that, you could have a good life in a brownstone neighborhood with a backyard, raise a family, life on the stoop kind of thing, right? And so there was a resurgence, and it's a generational thing, right? People who had kids who had grown up in my neighborhood started coming back to raise their families. Now that's harder to do because the prices go up. And the other issue is the influence of rezonings, which is a big issue. The community said, rezoning would be good. We're not going to get those commercial uses back. The real need is residential, and it's all residential now. But one thing that comes along with that is that those residences are pretty much luxury. There's very little affordability. We have many of our folks who have been living here for a long time and really can't afford to stay in the neighborhood. As they get older, they'd have to find an apartment that has an elevator that they can afford. And that's a challenge for people. And that's really a sad thing that is happening.
I've seen this, of course, all over the country in urban areas where you have gentrification pricing out people who traditionally have lived in those neighborhoods. Have you found that there are points of contest or division between neighborhoods that you border on? People representing districts that have economic levels quite different from yours. How do you, as an assembly member, deal with that disparity of income?
One of the things in a city like New York is we're very close to each other. So what happens on the other side of Flatbush Avenue affects my district just as much as what happens in my district affects people on the other side of Flatbush Avenue, right? As a community leader, one of the things that happened when I was in community was the proposal for the Atlantic Yards program. Barclay Center is the centerpiece of that. There's supposed to be massive amount of housing there. They paid no attention to how they could actually work with community to develop affordably there. We almost sued the city. We had a housing rights case ready to go for displacement of African Americans by the project. We anticipated that we would lose about 25% of the African American population from the 4 community boards that were supposed to get the preference for the affordability there. The census in 2020 proved that we were exactly right. 25% of the African American population has been displaced from those 4 community boards that were supposed to get the affordability. We need to do more affordability. We need to do more housing. We need to not drive people out of the city. The crisis in New York is affordability, not taxing. What we don't do in New York City, at least, is really do much of an assessment of what would work before we propose a rezoning. That does happen in other parts of the state and the country. I find that by working with other local elected officials, the community's voices are more powerful, and we're trying very hard to work together to not leave other people behind.
We're talking about working together, coordinating within the city. You mentioned earlier that stress point between the urban areas with certain needs, trying to provide equanimity, and the rural areas, which are battling to reestablish some of the economic viability they had. Is that stress point a major area of contention in the state legislature?
It is. The folks who represent a lot of the farmland, for example, are really fight hard to make sure that everybody knows that New York is in fact a very large agricultural producing state. People don't necessarily realize that. One of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, comments with delight every time he sees me eating cheese.
I didn't know that a big cheese industry in New York State.
Huge. And and we're also growing a lot of hemp, and you can make a lot of products out of hemp. Everybody assumes it's about cannabis. It's not. Also, let's face it, New York upstate did not get the investment it needed. A lot of its industries died. Kodak, Nestle, a lot of the big businesses that drove those big towns in New York State left. And those cities were left with very little economic development. And it really wasn't addressed effectively a long time ago. So there are systemic issues. There are systemic issues in New York City. There's a lot of issues around infrastructure, but infrastructure is not sexy, right? So people didn't invest in infrastructure the way they should have. We're trying to address those infrastructure needs. We had a big housing proposal from the governor. There were some things that were really good in it, but some things that just didn't work. For example, developers don't want to build big buildings in areas that don't have a sewer system that they can rely on. And we have a lot of places where that's the case. People would love to have more housing built, but they're really precluded because they don't have the infrastructure. That is not a problem just in New York City, where the infrastructure is terribly old and in many cases starting to break down. It's a problem in many other places where it was never really developed. So, those issues come up all the time. And, how do you divide up the pot of money where you have in the New York City and the counties surrounding New York City, most of the population of the state with tremendous needs. But we also have industry and huge swaths of New York State with many fewer people that are really also providing the food for New York State and for other parts of the country. The farm to table movement brings us a lot closer. There are a lot of people in New York City, I think, that are much more supportive of farmers markets and of farmers. And there's an effort among women in the state legislature, which is a bipartisan, bicameral caucus around nutrition and children. And that goes to farming and our food. There are environmental battles. A lot of the upstate people are very, very strong environmentalists, but there are a lot of issues around energy production where there's a battle around energy production and can we, meet those goals of our Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act on time and how energy feeds into that. Those are issues where there's a great deal of disagreement.
We're getting into the actual functioning of the Assembly. My understanding that much of the Assembly work is done in committee. And you serve on quite a few committees.
5 committees, one I chair and one is a commission. I chair the Ethics Committee. And because of that, I also co-chair the Legislative Ethics Commission.
How does public opinion get to and influence committee work?
Issues that are very topical, that are very important to people, will find their way to bills that legislators draft. And we'll find their way to committee agendas for that reason. There are some issues that appear to be very easy issues, but aren't. When it comes to public opinion, the downstream effects of certain decisions have consequences that are unintended. And that's always a challenge. And that there's also a challenge in getting a bill on a committee, right? And then there's also people who just, have disagreements or believe something that isn't accurate. And then you also have the influence of agencies that would be tasked with doing a lot of the work. Are they going to be supportive? Do they have the bandwidth to do the work? That's an issue that comes into the budget. For example, under the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the Department of Environmental Conservation has a huge amount of work to do. And so they are now staffing up because they're really going to be in development of regulations and in ensuring that the law gets implemented. So it's, the law, it's hard to pass sometimes, and then you have to implement it. And the legislature doesn't really have a role in the implementation, except for individual members to sort of watch out, see if there's a legislative tweak, see if we can have a hearing in how the implementation is happening, see how can we help with a budget or new technology. Public opinion is very strong when it comes to climate, as it should be. We don't have a planet B, as they say. So for those of us that have very environmentally sensitive locations, you have a lot of shoreline that can be flooded, for example, and was flooded in Hurricane Sandy. And, a lot of toxic areas in my district, and other colleagues have similar dynamics in theirs. We're really focusing on that and wanting to make sure that our state agency that's responsible for the environment has the tools and the staffing it needs to do the job that we have asked it to do.
Let's say somebody was considering running for state legislature. What would be the profile of what that person should bring to a position like that? Do you need a law degree?
No. Once upon a time, the legislature had many more lawyers in it. There are many, many, many people in the legislature that are not lawyers. There are a lot of people who got their internet law degree, as the speaker would say. You learn about laws and legislation, even if you're not a lawyer. And some people take to that more easily than others, because there's a lot of detail in the way legislation is drafted. So, no, you don't need a law degree. I think you need to have a finger on the pulse of your community. People come to the legislature from all types of positions. There are many former educators. One of my colleagues is a software engineer. So I think the legislature is improved by having people from all walks of life. Big issue that affects many of our districts is gun violence. There are those of us that have fought hard for gun violence prevention and gun safety measures. New York is overwhelmingly safer than most other states because we have strong gun laws. But, we can only control what we can control. And there are a lot of things that need to be done at the federal level.
Speaking about the mix of people who serve in the legislature, have you seen a change during your years of service there in the makeup of people coming in?
Yeah, I mean, this is my ninth year in the legislature. When I started, one of the things that had been happening was some of the activist groups were running men for seats where women had been in the assembly, and we were losing women in the assembly. And the Senate didn't have as many. So, what's a big change is more women running and more women having children while they're in office. Since the 2020 election, 3 people, all of whom were newly elected, had babies. Depending on their childcare concerns, we've had a lot of kids, with us in the assembly. Everybody loves the babies, so that has been, very welcoming place for moms. And because of their influence, we've really been able to further empower the Women's Caucus to center around those issues of children and family. And that goes, as I said, to issues like, nutrition. We have 150 assembly members. Now we have 50 women. When I started, 23% of the assembly was women. And so that's a big change in a short period of time. And the average around the country, it was 25% of legislatures were women. So we were behind the national average. Now we're ahead of it. And I think it's been a great plus.
What about racial mix?
That has also been changing. We have many more young women of color, many more people of color joining the assembly. Certainly in the city, it's a very large contingent. That's been increasing around the state. And also diversity. We have more people who are Asian. It's a small caucus, but growing. There are more members who are South Asian descent, for example. We have now more Muslims in the legislature. Still a small caucus, but more.
Can you share a personal experience or two that demonstrate the impact for the public of what you do? As you might imagine, people don't think about what you do on a daily basis and wonder, what are those folks in Albany doing for me?
Well, I think, one of the things that is hard for the public to know is different levels of government and what they do. And so, for example, we all deal with city issues, even though I have no vote in the city council and no control over city issues. But people come to you saying, why isn't that stop sign put in? Well, I've nothing to do with the stop sign. I can call the city DOT and ask them what's happening with that. But, I have no real say in that except to raise my voice, right? Which is what
But
I
you
do.
can fix the subways, can't you?
Well, it's the MTA. I'd like to go in with a wrench and fix the subways, but we do. That really is mostly a budgetary matter and an advocacy matter. So we push the MTA for the kinds of things we need. One of the things we've been pushing for years is more disability access, more elevators, more accessible subway stations. You're seeing that happening. One of the things, a lot of people probably not aware that it was my bill, the red flag law passed a number of years ago.
Excuse me, when you say it was your bill, what does that mean?
That means I was the lead sponsor and debated the bill and carried the bill and pushed for that bill. Obviously, there were co-sponsors. I will say we had a very large bipartisan vote in the assembly. Finally, it was passed in the Senate in 2019. We know that is a very good proactive measure. It is a way of keeping guns out of the hands of people who have demonstrated that they are a danger to themselves or others because they've made threats. They have talked about the use of guns. It's not complaining about the guy next door kind of thing. You need to have evidence that somebody has actually demonstrated that they are a danger to themselves or others. And so it's really a very judicious bill. It's civil. It's not a criminal proceeding. And you're seeing now that is something that people are talking about around the country. The Biden administration is very supportive of it. The governor has enhanced it, and we have funded county attorneys and others to be able to bring those civil petitions so that families are empowered to do it. We're making it more doable and encouraging education about that law on a statewide basis and now on a national basis. The other thing that's made a difference is my talking about dyslexia and reading. I have been working to improve the way our kids with dyslexia are taught how to read. and actually the way we teach our teachers how to teach reading in our institutions of higher education. We've been using methodologies that simply don't work. We're trying to change that. So I started Dyslexia Awareness Day in the Assembly 8 years ago. We have leaders from education and kids and families from all over the state attending, and they help us advocate for certain bills so that we're better able to address those needs. Our prisons, unfortunately, are places where a vast number of people have difficulty with reading. Many of them have undiagnosed or unaddressed learning disabilities like dyslexia, which is the most predominant disability. If we were better able to teach them how to read, we could empty our prisons and really change the world.
What's been most challenging for you about being an assembly member?
This year, the budget was very late, so that gives us a very compressed time frame to pass other bills that are not budget bills. But I think the most frustrating thing is you can pass any bill you want, but we're not the ones implementing it. So if the agencies that are involved aren't actually implementing the bill, that is very frustrating. And getting information sometimes is frustrating. It took me 6 months to get data on how many extreme risk protection orders were issued under the red flag law. And then there was the shooting in Buffalo, and all of a sudden that data was well known. And that shouldn't be. I should be able to get that data so that I can monitor its use. It's sometimes frustrating to know that while you have power, you only have your vote. You have to rely on other people to vote and have enough votes. So advocacy within the body is an important part of the job, is working with your colleagues on things that are important to them. And that isn't as obvious to your own constituents, maybe, but is important to getting things done.
What has been most rewarding for you being an assembly member?
The fact that you're actually able to make a difference in people's lives. Certainly, the efforts around reading and changing that conversation, passing, gun violence legislation, the environmental legislation that we've passed really is making a difference. After my first year in office, I wrote an op-ed where I talked about the two things that impressed me most. One was the budget process, where we really can say yes or no, or try to make a deal. And then the other thing was the way the assembly functioned as an institution. When I came in, about 2 weeks later, Shelley Silver, the speaker, was indicted. It was a very big deal. Listening to my colleagues, I got to know people, I think, better than I might have over a couple of years, because this was a gut-wrenching experience for so many people. We realized that people had to come together for the good of the assembly. It was not an easy process, but it was a very revealing process. What was impressive is that people did what was right for the whole, as opposed to for their own individual needs.
Well, speaking about turmoil at the top, Governor Cuomo resigned from office because of certain ethics situations. And there was a furor. Does something like that have an impact on the daily working of the legislature?
It certainly did. I think the legislature got a better budget because the governor was inclined to be responsive because of his other issues. I was somebody that called on him to step down early on. But then the whole issue about impeachment and what do you do? The law is very limited in terms of what's the penalty. People wanted us to impeach him even after he decided to resign. We don't have any provision for what to do. The only thing you can do after an impeachment is censure somebody or expel them. Right now, there's nothing that would stop him from running for governor again.
In 2022, you, as a maven of Brooklyn politics and community activism, who then became a state legislator, ran for U.S. Congress, which would have shifted you to Washington. You didn't win, then you went on to be reelected as state rep with over 90% of the vote. So apparently people were very happy to have you stay.
I would knock on doors, and there were people who would say, I don't want you to leave, because once you go to Congress, we won't see you as much. And, it was almost like they didn't want mom to go kind of thing. And so there were people who were like, I'm going to vote for somebody else because I want to keep you in the assembly. The voters made that call. So, it's sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation, unfortunately.
You are somebody who has shown at certain points in life, you will rejigger the thinking and make a change, make a move. Are you going to share with us what you're thinking about as a next move?
Listen, I am content where I am. I am a person who has taken risks. We want to encourage people to run. And I think women have to put themselves out there and run. I was talking about community and about disability rights issues in a way that most other candidates don't and haven't. And it changes that conversation around those issues. So I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I was able to affect the conversation in that race and build relationships. And that's the way government should work.
I'm going to end on a note about civics education. We started this series with the idea that people should know the person behind the label. It's wonderful. You've been so explicit and forthcoming with your comments. Civics education is so important, but it's disappearing. Any thoughts about how public officials, the media, educators can bring civics back to the forefront of public understanding and discussion?
I would say, as an educator and somebody familiar with education, it tends to be sort of fad oriented in some ways. And one of the fads that came about a couple of decades ago was not needing to educate kids about civics. And so most school systems stopped doing it. People don't know the different levels of government. They don't know how to participate. You've seen voter turnout is abysmal in many, many places. I happen to have a high voting district, but other colleagues of mine, their vote counts are a fraction of mine. And it's because their neighborhoods aren't acculturated to vote. So we need to make people understand. I think the young people, I'm forgetting which gen they are they Z or whatever, they are getting active, right? We need young people to become voters. In New York, I'm a co-sponsor of a bill that would allow 16-year-olds to register to vote in local elections. Hopefully we pass that law. But if not, when you turn 18, you're ready to go and you don't have to miss an election because you go, oh, I forgot to register, right? So it's very important that we encourage young people to become lifelong voters. That's what's critical. We need people to understand government, need to understand they have a role in government. They can influence things. When you look around the country and you see some of these races where people won by, one of my colleagues upstate won by 10 votes. Those 10 votes mattered. Every vote matters. It's easy for people to feel that their vote doesn't matter, but it really does.
Are there any bills being moved or discussed up in state legislature that are related to civics education?
Well, civics isn't something that the state education department prohibits in any way. When it's a sort of a curriculum thing, there is a lot of hesitancy to have the legislature decide what it is you should teach. But civics should come in under social studies. It doesn't have to be a separate course per se. And that really goes to the books. We need to influence those people who are writing the textbooks to include more civics in the social studies books. The school boards buy the books. This is an influence campaign more than anything. Don't buy a book for social studies, doesn't include a civics education. We need to influence them to realize they have power to change this.
Assemblymember Simon, you've been wonderful. I mean, it's so great to meet you in your capacity as a representative in New York State. And we thank you for joining us. It's part of that civics education, getting it out there and helping to stimulate the conversation.
What you're doing is very important piece of civics education. So thank you for taking that on and for bringing that message to people who really need to hear it.
Well, it's our great honor to be able to play some sort of role in this. We wish you the best of a good day, and thank you again.
Thank you. Take care.
There you have it, dear listeners, the latest episode in our Citizen Arts series, In Their Words, What Public Officials Do for Us. We hope you found this conversation with New York State Assembly member Joanne Simon enlightening, and we hope you'll join us for upcoming episodes with the likes of mayors, district attorneys, medical examiners, tax collectors, and more. At Citizen Arts, we're dedicated to presenting information, analysis, and constructive opinion about matters of civic importance. We're a not-for-profit 501c3 organization. Your interest in and support of our work are greatly appreciated. Please take a moment to subscribe to this podcast. It demonstrates your support of our work, very important as we continue building these podcasts. On behalf of Assemblymember Simon and my Citizen Arts colleagues, a heartfelt thanks for tuning in. I'm especially grateful to Jill Gabe, our executive producer, and Jeff Lewis, our project producer and technical guru. A special shout out to Kathy Chalfant, who connected us with Assemblymember Simon. We invite you to join the conversation. Please visit citizenartscreative.org and let us know what you think. And always, please stay healthy in mind and body, wealthy in goodwill, and wise in action.